The title of my book, The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution, I hope is surprising to some of you, because the middle class isn't a phrase that's in our Constitution. Economic equality, economic inequality also is nowhere to be found in our Constitution. But I actually think that our Constitution is all about economic equality and has a lot to do with the middle class. This might make you skeptical. These days, our Constitution is primarily used, it seems, to entrench the power of the economically powerful. For example, the First Amendment protects the rights of the wealthiest people and corporations to engage in political spending in campaigns. And that actually may deepen economic inequality rather than make it better. But for most of the history of the world, people thought that economic inequality would be a severe constitutional problem, and that you had to have a constitution that dealt with this. From the ancient Greeks until the 18th century, constitutional theorists were worried that when you had a society with economic inequality, either the rich would oppress the poor or the poor would try to confiscate the wealth of the rich. And the result would be violence, strife, even revolution. Now, the founding generation in America knew this history. They were steeped in history. And they worried that if the wealthy were to take over the government, they would pass laws to help themselves, slowly over time stacking the deck in their favor. John Taylor, a senator from Virginia, said in 1814 that when the rich plunder the poor, it is slow and legal. The people, increasingly angry at rising economic and political inequality, would respond. But this wouldn't happen through some sort of mass uprising. You may have heard of the rapper and future Broadway sensation Alexander Hamilton. But before he was involved in singing, he wrote in the very first of the Federalist Papers, "Of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants." So either you end up in an unequal society with an oligarchy, or the people revolt using the demagogue as their preferred form of help, and you end up with a tyranny. Now, statesmen and thinkers throughout history had two solutions to this problem, the problem of inequality. The first one was to incorporate economic class right into the structure of government. So in England, you have a House of Lords for the wealthy, a House of Commons for everybody else, all the commoners. In ancient Rome, you have a patrician senate for the wealthy and a tribune of the plebs for everyone else, the plebeians, the poor. I call these class warfare constitutions because they build class conflict right into the structure of government. Each class has a share in governing, but also a check on the other. Now, the second solution was first articulated by Aristotle, and Aristotle said that the best possible government was a government in which the middle class was bigger than the rich and the poor, and in which the middle class therefore governed. And he called this a middle constitution. I call it a middle class constitution. That's the title of the book. And this solution is something of a cheat. And it's a cheat because it basically says that if there isn't economic inequality in your society, then you don't have the problems that come with having economic inequality. So better to just not have inequality in the first place. So that's the middle class approach. Now, the founding generation, when we come to America, believed that our country was uniquely equal in the history of the world. That may seem surprising, but if you think back to what life was like in the late 18th century here, it actually sort of makes sense. Their frame of reference is Europe, and unlike Europe, there's no feudalism in America. Unlike Europe, there's no hereditary aristocracy in America. George Washington, one of the richest men in America, has an expansive plantation in Northern Virginia, a great house, Mount Vernon. You can go visit it today. But this is nothing compared to the palaces that the dukes and duchesses in England have. Massive marble Baroque palaces. And America had one other thing. It had vast lands available to the West, which meant that any white man, and it was only white men at the time, could become property owners. And I'll read you just a little bit of what people said, why this was important. So Noah Webster, who you might have heard of, he created the dictionary. Noah Webster said, that an equality of property is the very soul of a republic. While this continues, the people will inevitably possess both power and freedom. When this is lost, power departs, liberty expires, and a commonwealth will inevitably assume some other form. Charles Pinckney, who was at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, 230 years ago exactly, he said that America was not only very different from the inhabitants of any state we are acquainted with in the modern world, but also distinct from either the people of Greece or Rome or any state we are acquainted with among the ancients. America has a greater equality than is to be found among the people of any other country, and this equality will continue because we possess immense tracts of uncultivated lands, and there will be few poor and few dependent. So what you hear in this is two things. First, a belief that economic equality is essential for a republic, and second, that Americans are relatively economically equal. There's actually good reason also to believe that this wasn't just what people in the founding generation thought. It actually was true. So two economic historians, Peter Lindert and Jeff Williamson, who are at Berkeley and Harvard, respectively, have done a bunch of extensive work trying to figure out how much inequality there was in the founding generation. What they find is that in 1774, right on the edge of the American Revolution, the top 1% of Americans, the richest 1% of people in America, took home about 8.5% of the national income. So for comparison, that's identical to what the top 1% took home in 1976 in America, about 8.5% of national income. And I'll just point out, for the founding in 1774, that includes slavery. That includes considering slaves as people, not as property. So 8.5%. Today, the top 1% in America takes home more than 20% of national income. So wildly more equal society than we have today. And what Lindert and Williamson conclude is that in the late 18th century, America had the most egalitarian distribution of wealth of any place in the world. So with that backdrop of the belief of equality and the reality of equality, it makes sense that our founding generation didn't design our Constitution as a class warfare constitution. We have no tribune of the plebs. We have no property requirements or wealth requirements to be a US senator. And the framers knew how to write these provisions. In fact, there are provisions like that in the state constitutions drafted in the 1780s. And they even debated provisions like this during the Constitutional Convention. But our Constitution rejects them. We don't have any of those positions. And that is a radical change in the history of constitutions. And so what we have, I argue in the book, is a middle-class constitution, a constitution that is based on the assumption that America has and will continue to have relative economic equality. So over the course of the 19th century, everything changes. Industrialization, urbanization, the closing of the frontier, the shift from artisanal and agricultural work to wage labor in factories. These developments all put a serious strain on the economic foundations of our constitutional system. So by the time we get to the late 19th century and what we call the first Gilded Age, economic inequality was on the rise, and people were increasingly worried that economic power was being concentrated in a small number of robber barons and plutocrats who were using that economic power in order to shape politics. And so populists and progressives thought that it was necessary to act in light of this. What they saw around them was rampant bribery, corruption, and that kind of thing. And what I'll read you is just a passage from the book on some of the shenanigans going on in Montana in the 1890s, just to give you a feel for what happens when you have deep economic inequality and how it turns into political influence. Marcus Daly was determined to stop William Andrews Clark. Clark, like Daly, was an industrial magnate who owned copper mines, mills, smelters, lumber, banks, retail stores, newspapers, and utilities. But what Clark really wanted was to win elected office in Montana. Partly, he wanted the status and power that came with public leadership. Partly, he wanted to support policies that would improve his business holdings and harm those of Daley. When Clark stood for Congress in 1888, Daley men pasted their hand-picked candidate's name over Clark's name on ballots, leading to Clark's loss in an instance of spectacular fraud. And so began Montana's War of the Copper Kings. Over the next 2 decades, copper magnates in Montana would engage in some of the most blatant, surprising, and shocking efforts at corruption to gain political power in American history. Daley canceled business contracts with those who would not support his political aims. He started his own newspaper to compete with Clark's. The two fought over whether the state capital would be located at Anaconda, Daley's company town, or Helena, which Clark supported just to block Daley. And they gave away cigars, bought rounds of drinks, and sometimes just handed out money in an effort to garner support for one city or the other. Clark decided that 1899 was his last best chance to get into the Senate, and he was willing to pay legislators whatever it cost. The opening bid for a bribe was $10,000 a vote, with many reportedly coming in at $20,000 and one rumor of $50,000 for a single vote. Clark's son remarked that they would send the old man to the Senate or to the poorhouse. For his part, Clark said he never bought a man who wasn't for sale. Now, by some estimates, Clark spent $431,000 to buy 47 votes in the state legislature and offered more than $200,000 more that was rebuffed. Commenting on the brazen corruption in the election, Mark Twain said of Clark, "He is said to have bought legislatures and judges as other men buy food and raiment. By his example, he has so excused and so sweetened corruption that in Montana it no longer has an offensive smell." Senator William Clark took office in Washington, only to have investigations open immediately. After hearing testimony from state legislators and even Montana Supreme Court justices whom Clark's agents had attempted to bribe, the Senate Investigations Committee declared Clark's election void. In an amazing maneuver, Clark resigned, and his allies in Montana contrived to get the governor out of the state, making the lieutenant governor, who was a Clark ally, into the acting governor, at which point the lieutenant governor appointed Clark to fill the now vacant Senate seat that Clark had just been denied. So this was the kind of bribery and corruption that was going on in America in the 1890s. South Dakota Senator Richard Pettigrew, reflecting on this time when he was in Congress, said, "I could only form one possible conclusion, that the power over American public life, whether economic, social, or political, rested in the hands of the rich. America was no longer a republic. Plutocracy is a word that means rule by and for the rich. The United States is a country run by and for the rich. Therefore, it is a plutocracy." And that was a member of the US Congress from South Dakota. So in this period, progressives and populists were so concerned about what's happening to the republic that they realized something had to be done. As Teddy Roosevelt said, there can be no real political democracy unless there is something approaching an economic democracy. And so they came up with a bunch of creative solutions to try to revive America's economic democracy and its political democracy. On the economic side, they invented antitrust laws to break up big concentrations of wealth. They created public utilities regulations to keep monopolies in some sectors like electricity, but regulate it heavily so that it would have controlled rates. They passed a constitutional amendment to create an income tax so wealthier people would pay more. And they also passed minimum wage laws to raise the floor of wages for the working class. In order to prevent the economically powerful from unduly influencing politics, they passed the first real campaign finance regulations during this period, and they also passed a constitutional amendment so there would be the direct election of US senators instead of selection of US senators, which was leading to things like the bribery that Clark was doing. So these battles were battles to revive our republic, and what's really astonishing is when people talk about them, they talk about them in constitutional terms. Antitrust isn't justified on economic grounds, just about efficiency or prices for consumers. It's also partly justified as necessary to revive and preserve our republic. These fights continue, in different ways through the New Deal, but they really stop after World War II. And after World War II, we forget the idea that economic equality is essential to our constitutional system. It just disappears from how people think and talk about public policy. And I think this happens for three reasons. The first is that the New Dealers won the big constitutional battles over economic policy. There were fights in the 1930s about whether the federal government would be able to regulate the economy. The New Dealers win those fights, and there's a broad consensus that those battles are over. The second big change is the Cold War. From basically the founding of America through World War II, generations of people understood that a republic was very different from an aristocracy. And an aristocracy wasn't something that they read about in history books. It was actually the governments of Europe. There were aristocrats in them, hereditary aristocrats, in all of the governments of Europe, and they revolted against them in the Revolutionary War, and then they fled those countries as immigrants throughout the 19th century to come to this one, a republic. So the idea that a republic was not an aristocracy was a live one and one that was very concerning. After World War II, the big shift becomes the fight between communism and capitalism. And that replaces the shift between republics and aristocracies. And because communism has an egalitarian streak, many people became fearful of fighting for egalitarianism on economic grounds, even within our own democratic and republican tradition. And the third big thing that happened was we entered a period of expansive prosperity that economists like to call the Great Compression. GDP went up, median incomes went up, and America's middle class grew larger and larger in the post-war period. Partly this was a result of public policies that we undertook as a country. We regulated finance through the SEC and Glass-Steagall. We had extremely high 90% marginal tax rates in the post-war era. But we also invested in our own people. We created a GI Bill to get a generation to go to school. We got people houses through FHA loans. We built infrastructure like highways, which is a huge jobs program in part. And we invested in R&D from the space race to the internet, which over time created lots of jobs and new industries. We also, in this period, put in programs that would help lift people out of poverty, help the people who are worst off. Social Security in the New Deal era, and then Medicare, Medicaid, and Head Start in the 1960s. And so over time, economic inequality simply became less of an issue. Now, I hope that some of you from the beginning of my talk have been objecting silently, and I thank you for doing so silently, because what about women? And what about African Americans? What about all minorities? How can the story that I'm telling possibly coexist with the reality of inequality across groups from the very beginning? So in the book, I distinguish between two traditions. The first, which is the story I've told you so far, is the tradition I call the middle class constitutional tradition. And it holds that for there to be a republic, you have to have relative economic equality within the political community. But it leaves open a second question. Who's in the political community? Now, this question is one that's obviously been fiercely contested over our history, including violently contested over our history. But over time, we can trace another tradition, a tradition of inclusion, that has expanded the political community to include women and minorities. And I think the key thing to think about is what happens when these two traditions intersect. When you expand the political community, it now becomes necessary to ensure that all of the new members of the political community are also able to join the middle class. And throughout our history, in fact, statesmen understood this. So after the Civil War, for example, Reconstruction Republicans fought not just for political emancipation for the free slaves of the South, but for 40 acres and a mule, for economic justice as well. I'll give you an example from the book. Thaddeus Stevens, who was a Republican, Reconstruction Republican from Pennsylvania, he proposed confiscating the land of the top 10% of rebel planters in the South, Confederate planters in the South, and redistributing that land to their former slaves. And here's what he said about this proposal. He said, "Without this government can never be, as it has never been, a true republic. Heretofore, it had more the features of aristocracy than of democracy. The southern states have been despotisms, not governments of the people. It is impossible that any practical equality of rights can exist where a few thousand men monopolize the whole landed property. The larger the number of small proprietors, the more safe and stable the government. If the South is ever to be made a safe republic, let her hands be cultivated by the toil of the owners or the free labor of her intelligent citizens. This must be done even though it drive her nobility into exile. If they go, all the better. After his death in 1868, one of Stephen's colleagues said about his views, he knew that a landed aristocracy and a landless class alike are dangerous in a republic, and by a single act of justice, he would abolish both. It wasn't just the Reconstruction Republicans who understood this. The civil rights of the movements of the 60s understood this principle as well. We often forget this, but when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington, the title of that march was officially the March for Jobs and Freedom. It was about economic opportunity, not just civil rights. Now, the interplay between these traditions isn't clean and neat. Some movements, like the Jacksonians, were inclusive economically, but not racially. The Reconstruction Republicans expanded voting for African Americans, but not for women. But other traditions were more inclusive. There was a strand of populists in the 1890s who tried to build a biracial coalition in the South in order to break the power of the planter aristocracy, as they said. And the civil rights movement obviously worked on race, gender, and economics all at once. So today, I think our challenge is that we are in an era of economic inequality. And this is in conflict with our constitutional system because our constitutional system is designed for a society that doesn't have serious economic inequality. So the question is, what do we do about this? And I think the first thing that we could do is we could abandon the project of being a middle-class nation. We could embrace the class warfare approach that governed most republics from the beginning of the West in ancient Greece until the 18th century. We could say, for example, that senators have to be millionaires and that to be a member of the House of Representatives, you have to make less than the median income in America. And in fact, throughout our history, there actually have been proposals to this effect. And even today, there's actually commentators who've suggested that we should revive the tribune of the plebs as part of a way to make America's government work again. But I think these proposals are unlikely, to say the least, and probably undesirable for a variety of reasons as well. So the second option that we have is that we can rebuild our middle class, reshape our economy, and actually make our politics more democratic. And I think there's a lot of things that we can talk about here, whether it's raising the minimum wage, organizing working class people through unions and political movements. We can talk about political reforms like voting, gerrymandering, campaign finance reforms. But we need to, I think, take inspiration from the progressive era, where the move was to both reshape the structure of the economy so it worked better for people, and to reshape the political system so that it was more responsive to people. And the bottom line, though, that I want to leave you with is that we have to do these things not just for economic reasons, which is how we often think about economic inequality, and not just for moral reasons, which is often how people talk about the importance of anti-poverty efforts. We actually have to do these things if we want to preserve our constitutional system. And the amazing thing about this is that the founders actually understood this. They knew they were building a constitution on a set of economic assumptions, and they knew those assumptions would sometimes, at some point, change, and that conditions would change. And so what I'll leave you with is just a passage from James Madison, who toward the end of his life commented on what was going to happen, predicted the future of America. And here's what he said. He said that he now predicted that by 1930, this is in 1829, he predicts that by 1930, the population would be so concentrated in America that people would be necessarily reduced by a competition for employment to wages which afford them only the bare necessities of life. Over time, the proportion being without property would increase. When it did, Madison concluded, the institutions and laws of the country must be adapted, and it will require for the task all the wisdom of the wisest patriots. And so, as Madison saw then, the future would require wise patriots to reform the system when economic inequality became acute. And I think that's what we require today, is wise patriots who can address our economic system and our political system in order to save our constitutional system and our republic. Thank you. So what we'll do is I will take some questions, and there's somebody with a microphone here who's going to walk around, and we'll.
Hey, long time no see.
Maybe you should say just your first name.
Yeah, my name is Ravi, and I saw a talk once by Ben Horowitz who kind of compared the Haitian Revolution, the kind of grouped together the Haitian Revolution, South Africa, and India together as kind of more inclusive revolutions, kind of thinking ahead and not dominating the sort of people that you overthrow, versus like the French Revolution, which was more violent and I would say domineering. Is there anything comparative constitutional analysis you've done to say the way you take power, the people who take power, what has happened after, like what values have been embedded in constitutions? Is there anything we can learn from other revolutions that were more populist but still not violent?
So it's a great question and a really big one. There are, so the first thing that I'll say is there's a lot of debate about the relationship between economic factors and revolutions. And for a long time, the biggest, I would say a general trend was that people believed that all good things went together. If you had increasing, rising middle class, increasing economic growth, you would get more political democracy, more stability, better rule of law, better regimes across the board. That was a theory for a while. And then what happened in the mid to late 20th century is that wasn't the case. There was actually economic growth and rising middle classes, but political instability. And in fact, Sam Huntington, Barrington Moore, and others argued, going back, in fact, to James Harrington, who I talk about, who argues in the 17th century in England, that a rising middle class actually demands political equality because it sees that it has more economic power. And this creates instability in societies that are not democratic already. And so you see a lot of authoritarian societies transformed or reformed because a middle class is pushing forward political change. And that, in the short term, actually creates instability rather than stability. So that's one piece of the story. In terms of what happens after, there's a lot of changes and there's a lot of different paths. So just the examples that you gave. So India and South Africa have some things that are in common. They're both former British colonies that are transitioning from colonialism to independence in their revolutionary moments. They also have some very, very different things, right? There's a system of apartheid that happens in South Africa that then is reformed in the period in the 90s and in the 80s and 90s. India is, 50 years earlier and has a different kind of system in its path forward. So there's a lot of challenges in kind of comparing across because there are these different models out there. The one thing I would say about who takes power afterwards is that some revolutions have as their goal social and economic change as part of their story. And the classic story is that the French Revolution was a social and economic revolution. It was about poverty. It was about the people all together. The classic story is also the American Revolution was not. It was only a political revolution, a revolution in the form of government, but not a revolution in society or in all the aspects of society. And the theorists who've said that about America have said the reason why we had a political and not an economic revolution is we didn't have feudalism. We didn't have the entrenched system of aristocrats and serfs that they had in Europe. And so that led to a kind of more reformist and only political set of changes rather than a more whole society set of changes. So that's a little bit, at least on this. I think models looking forward, I at least as a both person who's read a fair bit of history and studies some comparative politics, hesitate to draw many conclusions from particular foreign examples beyond just kind of design strategies, because I think all of these cases are so contextualized in this particular history of a specific country, that you really have to know quite a bit about any given system and why it worked out the way it did, and translating from one place to another may be as risky as trying to just impose your will on a society or something. It may not work at all. So I'm a little hesitant about that. Yeah.
Ganesh, I'm glad to know you're a design strategist for the next revolution. This is awesome. This is yeah. Professors have gotten very interesting these days. A quick question, since you're very involved also in contemporary politics, not just being an academic. What do you make of the rise of the billionaire class that's winning elections? Not just President Trump, but Rauner in Illinois, Baker in Massachusetts, and of course we're in New York City, so there was a certain wealthy mayor here for 13 years who many progressives claim to love. So speak a little bit about how these examples, who are generally the three I invoked, are actually claimed to be in the moderate middle and socially liberal and progressive, with air quotes there. How does that jibe with your analysis of plutocracy?
So the first thing that I'll say is that you can't, as a categorical matter, say that any class of people all will have the same views or take the same approach to things. There's obviously exceptions. We can make generalizations based on data. In general, we can say, wealthier people believe X, Y, and Z. We have polling, we have data that shows that. But you can't say that everyone has a certain set of preferences. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of extremely wealthy people who ran America, Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, who also were very involved in deeply structural reforms to the economy that harmed members of their own economic class. And they were known as traitors to their class for that reason. So there are exceptions to what I'm about to say, but I think as a general matter, I think it's troubling that we have a system that is increasingly enables and makes it easier for people of quite great means to take power. And part of the reason for that is throughout our history and throughout the history of republics, one thing that people have been worried about is that if you don't have people who are connected to or represent the interests of ordinary Americans, they will become dissociated from those interests and won't actually even know how to think about the challenges that people face. And this is a problem that we see, and that is the real worry of oligarchy. The worry is that over time, people's preferences diverge when they become unequal. So wealthier people start to believe that the policies that support their own interests are good for society generally, because they're good for them. It justifies the policies that they want. And they also start to believe that they deserve the wealth that they have. They don't become luck egalitarians. They start to think that it's all about merit and earned. And often, there's a lot of work that goes into it, but there's also a lot of other people that help, and there's a whole society that has public education and the rule of law and a variety of other things that help too. But what happens over time is you get a divide in how people think. And so in the run of cases, people become more likely to think that what people like them think about policy is what's just good policy, or what's good for people, or what people think. And often that's not the case. And so I find it troubling and problematic, because I think it's very, very hard. There's the old saying, it's hard to get a man to believe something when his paycheck depends on him not believing it. And I think there's some truth to that. It's very, very hard to break out of the set of beliefs when you have material interests in them. And so the challenge that I would have for all the kind of billionaire class people who get into politics is how many of them actually push forward policies that go against the economic interests of them and others who make that much money, when there is a trade-off between those interests and the interests of the worst off in our society, or even the middle class in our society. Now, all of that said, there are many who actually are willing to make some of those trade-offs. So, Mark Zuckerberg gave a graduation speech at Harvard just a few weeks ago, and one of the things he said is that he should pay much, much higher taxes, and that he told all the graduates in the audience, you all are going to make a lot of money, even if you're not billionaires, and they should pay a lot higher taxes too. So there are some people who do think in these terms and are willing to trade off their economic interests. But that would be my challenge to the billionaire classes. Are they actually pushing for the kind of economic reforms that create broad-based growth for everyone and make us a more equal society or not?
Yeah, I really like your sort of attempt to save the progressive era. That's really beautifully done. And the progressive reformers. One of the things that I keep thinking about, and I'd like to push you, like some previous speakers, about comparative aspects. I guess one of the a priori assumptions of your work is that this is a constitutional order worth, replicating, strengthening, and so forth, correct? But I think when you look at the sort of history of progressive politics in this country, the Constitution, we always like to sort of think as it's the oldest Constitution still functioning in the world. Well, there's written one, right, except Britain. But and in so many ways, it is limiting progressive politics because it is so emasculating the power of the state that I think needs to be mobilized in many instances on behalf of the poor, of the disadvantaged. When FDR gave his inaugural speech in 1933, what he did say was, we have to attack the Great Depression as though it was a foreign foe that attacked this country. And there's a beautiful book by Michael Sherry, who sort of looks at that and says, well, can we only mobilize the power of the state on behalf of ordinary citizens in times of war? And all the rhetoric that you do see in the time, over the course of the Great Depression that, use these militaristic metaphors, sort of speaks to the idea that, this is in so many ways such an outdated constitution. You saw this, in the struggle over healthcare, over, the individual mandate, that had to be tied and, and in so many ways had to, you had to go through all these convoluted, arguments in order to justify that. So, I guess it comes down to, is it time really maybe to look at far more fundamentally at the U.S. Constitution than what you're proposing?
So one thing that I'll say is I don't take the argument that the Constitution is so severely limiting as you put it. And the interesting thing about our history is that throughout our history, there have been different traditions in thinking about the Constitution. One that I trace through the book is this middle class idea, and what you'll see throughout it is people who advocate for a variety of policies on constitutional grounds, and in some cases even say they're constitutionally mandated. So the Reconstruction Republicans think that redistribution of wealth in the South is necessary under the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that gets rid of slavery. And they say that you cannot really do that without the economic component, and that is justified by the 13th Amendment. Now today, we have a very restrictive view of the 13th Amendment, but the drafters of the 13th Amendment didn't have that view. So there have been different ways that we've interpreted many of these things. If you take Citizens United as another example, it's a 5-4 decision. There are 4 justices who think something very different from what the 5 justices think, and these are not kind of random people. These are distinguished jurists. So I think throughout our history, there have actually been places, and what's surprising is that many of these constitutional traditions we've just forgotten. And I think that's what's striking is that after World War II, and especially in the last 30 years, our constitutional dialogue has become impoverished, particularly on the progressive side, but across the board, by virtue of not having in it a set of arguments about mobilizing people, about the appropriate role of government in terms of and judges especially, in terms of being limited and allowing the people's representatives to do things that are necessary for our society. And so I think there's a lot more space there than people think. And some of the historical resources in the book, I hope will nudge people to see that we can actually be that our Constitution actually is pretty good on those grounds. And I'll just say one other thing. The reason why it works is that it's really short. If you've read the Constitution, it's really short. It actually doesn't say a lot of stuff. A lot of modern constitutions are extremely long. They have very, very detailed provisions throughout them. I mean, there's constitutions that note, the powers of municipalities and police departments and have provisions about water resource boards in the Constitution. Our Constitution doesn't talk about that. So in a sense, it's actually, if we can see it as capacious in allowing politics, democracy, to fill the space. And I think that's really what our republic is about. Up front here. Oh, and then we'll go over here afterwards. Yep.
Thank you so much for this interesting talk. I look forward to reading the book. And I am approaching this book as a historian, right? So not as a legal scholar. So that sort of frames my question. I'm interested in your argument that the Constitution is premised on a set of economic assumptions. And my big question is, well, there was a lot of inequality throughout the end of the 18th century, the 19th century. So if it really was so contingent, the success of the Constitution was so contingent on some degree of economic equality, why did it take so long for there to be a moment of progressive reform at the beginning of the 20th century? In other words, I want you to maybe flesh out the historiographical narrative that you're offering. And the standard historiographical narrative is that progressive era reform emerged in response to the industrialization of the late 19th century. But what you're proposing is that there needed to be some equality. So why did it last as long as it did, the Constitution? Why didn't we have a political crisis earlier?
So, great question. So the first part is I would say that in the late 18th century, at the time of the founding, there's obviously inequality in every society, but there's a relative degree of equality, economic equality at that time. There are actually, through the 19th century, moves for reform along the way. And I think they trace pretty well across that period and rise in their urgency over that period, culminating, I would say, with the progressive era at the beginning of the 20th century. So early on, the Jacksonians, for example, in the 1820s and then 30s, are very, very concerned about the power of banks and commerce and the wealthy. And they have responses to this. They have policy responses. Andrew Jackson vetoes the national bank, even though he says it's unconstitutional and that it transfers money and power from the ordinary people to the wealthy and creates privileges for them that entrench their power and wealth. And so he vetoes the bank, even though John Marshall has previously found it constitutional, and it's been working pretty well, actually. So that's a response that happens in that period. In that same period, you get the creation of the first working men's movements, is what they're called, which are kind of proto-labor unions and labor movements. Right here in New York, actually, you see a lot of those movements in the 1820s and 1830s. And that grows in that period in the mid-19th century. And there's people who are very, very worried about economic inequality rising. And it starts in places where commerce and industrialization and inequality are growing. So it starts in the mill towns and those kind of places in Massachusetts. It starts here in New York, where there's a lot of economic growth and industrialization on the early sides of that. And by the time we get to the Gilded Age in the late 19th century, so post-Civil War, this is everywhere. And it's the populists all across the country pushing for massive reforms to a wide variety of sectors in the economy, whether it's regulating railroads or in 1892, the populists advocate for equal pay for equal work for women, using exactly that phrase, equal pay for equal work. So you see all these reforms even in that period as well. So I think there is a story of reform that goes throughout this, and a lot of the kind of intellectual forebears of the populists and the progressives are actually coming out of these earlier traditions as well. There were two questions on this side, so yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming. Thanks for giving this talk. Thanks for writing this book. Thanks for working for Senator Warren.
You're welcome. I like this question.
So I'm curious your thoughts on land and its effect on all of these things today. You talked about land at the time of the founding and that it was plentiful and abundant and there were essentially no limits so that people could, if they were poor, simply, write GTT on their fence and just move west and find land and have a chance to become property owners. And you talked about, I think it was Madison's prediction that would no longer be true. Everyone would be compact into cities and wages would be driven down and there would be inequality, et cetera. Well, now we have this sort of bizarre phenomenon where in cities we have high populations that drive down wages and create inequality, tremendous inequality, and that returns on capital become much greater than returns on labor. But we also have a completely opposite phenomenon in rural areas where populations are extremely sparse and getting sparser and sparser as innovations in farming make labor less important and as people move from rural areas to the cities. And that in a lot of ways mirrors our sort of political divide in America and creates a lot of interesting implications where people just don't talk to people across that rural-urban divide. So that, for example, many Trump supporters believe that they are in the lower class in America when actually their income is substantially higher than many people in cities, and a number of other miscommunications that sort of happen. What are your thoughts on how land plays a role in equality, in income inequality today, and wealth equality today, and the political implications of that?
So I think the biggest part of the land story when we think about property as a form of wealth, the biggest part of that story is an old story, and it's the story of agriculture and land being the central form of wealth for most of human history through until the Industrial Revolution. And in that phase, when you have capital that is not that is both machine capital or other kinds of capital, and that has significant returns, you have this shift. And so with the kind of agricultural shift to factories and the move from farms to cities, which all happens 100 years ago, it's hugely dislocating for society, a major issue. So I think that's the biggest part of the story. Today, I think the story about land is maybe one that is less focused on land as wealth, though there's a component of that you see in some cities. And the way that I would say this is that I think it actually overlaps with some of the dislocations you're talking about, and with some other ones, which is today much of how we organize ourselves is land, but land in ways that are zoned in certain ways that restrict who can live in what areas. And so restrictive zoning in big ways leads to neighborhoods where people all just live together with people like themselves. Schools, or public schools especially, are set up to serve neighborhoods. They're funded through those neighborhoods, and so you end up again with people moving to a wealthy suburb which has great public schools, but not in other places. And so you have this concentration and kind of segregating of our society into a lot of different pockets. And I think land is part of that story, migrated through this weird local government story about zoning and a variety of other local government things that shape that. So I think that's probably where the biggest place comes in, biggest set of things come in on land.
Hi, this is really interesting. Thank you. So if I understand part of your argument correctly, it's that there was a shift in framing the driver for equality from aristocracy versus republic to communism versus capitalism. Is that right?
That's an argument.
An argument, yeah.
A factor, yeah.
So could you trace, please, how you did or would show the subsequent effect on that kind of reframing to maybe changes in policy, or how the populace kind of reconceptualized what would or wouldn't be appropriate for equality?
Yeah, so the best example of this that I talk about in the book is what happens in the 1930s and 40s, and even in the 50s too. So in that whole period, what you see is multiple different red scares and a lot of fear-mongering over communism, some of which is appropriate. There were spies in America who were communist spies. Some of it was a political witch hunt designed primarily by, in that period, anti-communist, but also Republicans against anti-communist but Democrats. And so in that era, you get a lot of attacks on people who are just trying to do more egalitarian economic and social policies on grounds of communism, that they must be communists. And so the two things happen from that. One is there's an attack on those policies, but two is there's a chilling effect, that people start offering less reformist and less radical policies because they're concerned about being attacked for them. And so that happens in that period. And there's a great book by Landon Storrs called The Second Red Scare that documents very well some of the people who are impacted by this, who are just social policy reformers, people who work on Social Security, people who work on consumer issues, labor issues, women's rights. I mean, people who worked on those kinds of issues were often targeted as communists or socialist sympathizers, and went through, hell and back in terms of in terms of what happened to them afterwards. Thank you very much for coming.